we're doing a like return to running progression, right? After like a knee injury. And just like walking around, not doing anything athletic, you can call it pain, you can call it awareness, whatever it is. It's like a sort of a 3 out of 10. Like when they do something that's even pretty benign, they're like, yeah, like I noticed some discomfort, awareness, stiffness, whatever you want to call it. It's just something that like it's registering that like one knee is different than the other. I'll say like if your baseline is say a 3 out of 10, if we do this like new activity, whether it's like a strength exercise, a running progression, I don't obviously if you walk around at a 3 out of 10, I don't expect it to be a 0, right? Because we're doing something new that's like harder than what you're normally doing.
Yeah, that's a good
so
point.
I'm like, as long as what we're doing is like pretty close to what your baseline is, like it could be like a little bit over. So again, these are arbitrary numbers, but if you walk around at a 3 and we go up to a 4, maybe even a 5, I'm okay with that. But I don't want to go much beyond your baseline because then you're going to get probably more sensitive and it's going to drive that cycle of inhibition. So, it's somewhat subjective, but I'm like, obviously I don't want someone to do something where they're in like sharp, debilitating pain. But if you walk around and you feel your knee just like going up and down the stairs, if we're doing a running progression, then you're going to feel your knee because you feel it walking, right? Or you feel it doing a body weight squat. And so again, like when I introduce a novel activity, I'm okay with some awareness and even pain, as long as it's like kind of close to their baseline and doesn't exceed it too much.
On the flip side, you talked about, the person that they were very reluctant to let go of the crutches and they were kind of holding on to that. On the kind of flip side of it, what about somebody that they're doing better, they're progressing, and then it's almost getting close to discharge time, for lack of a better term. For our strength coaches, it's now closer to, hey, you're going to get into practice, you're going to play in games, and you're good to go again. Have you had athletes, patients, whatever terminology, that go back and they're like, man, I don't know. And like, how had you handled that? And then how do you recommend it to our coaches out there doing any rehab with their athletes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And that's really, it's like, it gets into the psychological readiness, right? And, you discharge somebody and then, well, they might have some doubt about going back to the sport. I mean, look, at the extremes, like it does become sort of a psychological issue, but I think that the physical and the psychological are kind of one and the same. I think if you use the right progression, that's seldom an issue. Because if someone's like, well, I don't feel comfortable like going back to practice now, it's because you didn't do enough challenging things in rehab to make them confident.
But what if you did? And what if their listeners like, but we did?
Yeah. I mean, I think that situation is more rare than, because I think a lot of times people use it as a cop out. They're like, oh, well, like the athlete's not running. They blame the athlete. It's like, well, you didn't do things that duplicate the speed and intensity of it. And like clearly in a controlled environment, whether it's like a strength and conditioning setting or a rehab setting, you can only mimic the game so much. But I think for the most part, you can somewhat simulate the physical demands of the game. I mean, look, like I don't have like 10 like role players or people where I can play like a small sided game in my clinic, right? But we do things, we'll do reactive things. We're doing things with like full intent. We're running at max velocity. We'll do some like reactive cutting. Granted, it's not like reacting to an opponent. Doesn't have the same sort of perceptual demands as like playing a sport. But like, as far as like the stress on the tissues and the joint, like we are simulating that. But if that does happen, where like, in this theoretical situation, someone has gone through the right physical progression, they still have sort of some, psychological doubt, then I think you have to kind of like just take a step back and it's like, all right, like what is it that you're reluctant to do? And then just try to reverse engineer that situation and put them in a situation where it's like, all right, well, what's the closest thing to the thing that you fear that you can do without a lot of apprehension? We're going to start with that and then sort of build it back up. And it always comes back to that. It's like, what do you want to do? Where are you now? And like, let's try to find a systematic progression from point A to point B. And in the scenario that you bring up, maybe you think they're quote unquote ready, but if they don't feel ready, then maybe you take a step back and just sort of build them back up and then hope that at the end of that sort of second sequence or progression, they're further along than where they were at the end of the first progression.
No, that makes a ton of sense, and I'm sure that's helpful for our listeners out there. One of the things you said that really resonated with me right there was the fact that maybe you didn't replicate the exact demands of the game in practice from a perceptual action, but you did with the joint and the muscular
Yeah.
specificity. Wow, that was a mouthful. That's something that I took a lot of pride in, doing my rehab work with the guys on the field before they'd get to practice. Talk about how you guys do that and kind of help guide our listeners with how they should kind of structure some of these things to be able to do that, whether they're in a private practice like you or at the university or college setting.
Yeah, and that comes back to like there's always this debate between when it comes to like change of direction and agility, right? It's like I think a lot of times people create these false dichotomies, like, well, it's the fixed rehearsed drills versus the reactive perceptual, as if and like most coaches that I know, like no one's doing like totally one of the. I don't really know too many coaches who are like this boogie straw man of like you're only doing like the 5-10-5s and like the things that look really good that are rehearsed. But that's more of a strength and conditioning debate. In rehab, you absolutely, in my opinion, have to do the rehearsed stuff first, because you have to know that like that the joint and the tissues that were injured can handle.
Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about our membership site. If you find value from our podcast, you are guaranteed to find more value inside of the Strength Coach Network video library inside the membership. Doesn't matter the level coach you are, you can see all of our 170 plus lectures sorted 3 different ways. Based on the level of expertise coach you are, aspiring, established, or head, you can sort it by every sport imaginable, and you can sort it by every topic in strength and conditioning. This makes all of the content consumable, easy for you and for your staff members to be able to deep dive on any topic in strength and conditioning. Click the link down below to try the site out for 24 hours for only $1. Then your membership turns into a monthly membership where the price is less than $30 a month. For $29.99, which is less than going out to dinner by yourself, you have access to all of this content. Click the link down below.
What it means to do a cut. And if you just throw somebody into like a reactive situation, they can work around the issue. So a lot of times, there's this whole concept of self-organization, and it's like, well, whatever the athlete comes up with, that's the best strategy because they self-organized it. But that's only true if they have options from which to self-organize. So if we're talking about like doing a cut, and you have an athlete, let's say they hurt their left knee and now they're planting off their left leg, if that leg does not have full range of motion, does not have concentric and eccentric strength. If in the lower leg, right, even below the knee, like you don't have sufficient like elasticity and reactivity, you don't have the right mechanics at the hip, like that you're never going to see what you want to see in a cut, whether in a rehearsed activity or in a reactive activity, because the joint, you don't have like the position and the motor control to do what it is that you want the athlete to do. So if an athlete, like even an uninjured athlete, if you have them do that activity and they do something that doesn't look like quote unquote a good cut, and you're like, well, that's how the athlete self-organized, therefore that's the best solution. You don't know if it's the best solution until you actually do a little bit of a deeper dive and you figure out like, well, can the athlete under maybe a more rehearsed and a more controlled situation, can they actually do what we think looks like a good cut? And if in that situation they can do the good cut, but then in more of like a reactive sort of chaotic situation, they do something different, well, maybe there is kind of adaptive value to doing what we think isn't the ideal cut, because maybe the athlete in the more chaotic situation is accounting for more variables besides just like, hey, plant off your left leg and go to your right. But in a rehab setting, until you do the very, very controlled type of activities, you don't know if when you get into the more reactive situations that the athlete like has options from which to self-organize, or basically can make a choice. Because granted, these choices don't occur on a conscious level, but if the athlete can't get into certain positions in a controlled environment, they're not going to do it when it's reactive and chaotic. So in a rehab setting, like, yeah, we're doing like the control type things first, once like strength and range of motion are achieved, because we want to make sure that the athlete like can, let's say like when they cut to the left, that like their knee like actually will bend and they have some eccentric strength in their knee and they can use their quad to push off, versus using more of a hip strategy where their knee's not going to amortize, so to speak. Their knee's not going to bend. They're just going to kind of like vault off their hip. or, we want to make sure that an athlete that's cutting off the left leg, like in a controlled environment, they can like have a kind of a lower, spend like a short amount of time on the ground. And maybe if they do something in a chaotic environment, if they're spending more time on the ground, it's because that's the right solution, and not because in a more controlled environment they don't have the ability to get off the ground quickly and have a low ground contact time. So that's where, like, again, in the strength and conditioning world, if we're working with like 100% healthy athletes, yeah, like I probably don't think there's that much of a place for some of these like more rehearsed type of change of direction scenarios. But in a rehab setting, you absolutely have to do that, because you don't know. First of all, it's also safer, right? Like, to take somebody and the first time they change direction, they're reacting to either like a tactile or an audible cue, or to an opponent. Like, that's just not safe. I mean, from like a tissue tolerance standpoint, like, we want to make sure that we can use progressive overload even with a change of direction activity. And it's hard to do progressive overload and kind of like regress a change of direction when you have an opponent that's like you have to react to, right? So in the rehab setting, there's definitely a place for both like the fixed, so more predictable activities than the more reactive, chaotic activities.
For any of our listeners out there, regardless private or university professional setting, exactly what you just said, Doug, is why I love DeMarco and Jordan and Elon's 8-vector. And
it's great.
to
I just
me,
read that book, actually.
right? And so you do that in your early off season, or you do that in your early return to play, because now you know with confidence, hey, they've done, call it 180 back, or call it, straight back, whatever, a 0-degree cut, but you've done it right and left, coming straight back, 45 degrees down, 90 degrees each way, 45 up. And then you can say it with some conviction, and you can even regress that with the jumping that they've done, or you can do it where maybe it's only, a 3-yard change in direction, 180 degrees back. You can do it 5 yards, 10 yards. So you're increasing the speed of it, right? And then you can even add an extra change in direction off of it. So now, not for nothing more than, to me personally as the practitioner, I can sleep at night knowing that the joint angle specificity and the muscles, tendons, ligaments, like, you've laid down that fascial strain. And then, yes, you could put, use your hand in low level, shuffle them side to side, where they're doing that perception, reacting to your hand, in addition to all of that 8-vector, right?
No, that's great. And that also, I mean, you didn't ask this question specifically, but there's a whole controversy debate in rehab about like what's the best battery of tests to get somebody to clear someone to play. And the thing is, like, how many tests are you allowed to have? Because you made the point about the 8-vector system, that the 8-vector system isn't an assessment, it's a training system. Yeah. And to me, the training system and the process of rehab is more diagnostic than saying, like, we're going to do these 4 tests, because it's like, all right, well, what 4 tests encompass all those things that you just mentioned, and like all those different degrees of cuts? And then, it's one thing doing a cut when you're entering the cut from like 5 meters versus 10. Like, what kind of momentum are you generating before you go into the cut? You get that if you have the right training system and the right progression. Just doing like a hop test or an isokinetic quad strength test, like, I'm not saying those things aren't valuable, but there's no battery of tests, unless you're doing like 100 tests, that are, in my opinion, as predictive as the training process, assuming you have a good process. And that's, I think a lot of times, like, a lot of fields, whether it's physical therapy, strength and conditioning, they have to work at the lowest common denominator. So it's like, well, if somebody passed these 4 tests, that's a minimum standard, but that still doesn't tell you anything, because, hop test, quad strength test, something else, a broad jump, it's like, great, but that's not nearly as comprehensive as something like the 8-vector system. Now, the 8-vector system isn't a test that's like quantifiable necessarily. I mean, it is quantifiable in that you can keep track of it, but it's not like a known, validated, like, here's an ACL return to sport test. But I would take something like the 8-vector system over 4 or 5 tests that are validated in a research paper any day of the week, because that's exposed to an athlete to way more things. And like, if there's a chink in the athlete's armor, so to speak, it's going to be revealed in that 8-vector system. It's not going to be revealed necessarily in 4 tests.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.